tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Continuing on with chapter 11, Happiness of Buddha Dhamma by P.A. Payutto, translated by Robin Moore. And today I'll just be reading about 3 pages. This is page 916 to 918. And this is a section of part of titled Practice Free from Suffering. And I'll be reading a sutta that's mentioned in here. Practice free from suffering. The spiritual journey begins with an understanding of happiness. As one progresses along the journey, there is another key principle that directly benefits one's practice. This principle has to do with how one relates to happiness, and it also pertains inherently to one's relationship to suffering. In the Devadaha Sutta, the Buddha outlines this method of practice in regard to happiness. It contains 4 factors. 1, to refrain from creating extra suffering for oneself. 2, to not forsake righteous happiness. 3, to not indulge in any sort of happiness, even righteous happiness. 4, to strive in order to bring an end to the cause of suffering. In other words, to strive in order to realize higher forms of happiness, all the way to supreme happiness. Just a note that now he's going to go and describe each one of these 4. First, to refrain from creating extra suffering for oneself. It is common for people to create unnecessary suffering for themselves. They may be abiding in a state of well-being, free from distress, yet still inflict suffering on themselves. Example of this are those people who drink excessive amounts of alcohol or indulge in addictive drugs. Many of them begin out healthy, yet still consume these things, even though they clearly know that they are harmful, both physically and mentally. Although they possess this knowledge, they create suffering and problems. On a more subtle level, people often gather and accumulate various sense impressions, like sights or sounds, that are slightly bothersome or annoying. Trivial things done or said by others, things that are part of the past, are stored up in people's minds. Later, when they are alone, they dig these things up and proliferate over them, causing misery and unhappiness. This is another example of piling suffering onto oneself. In respect to householders, it is not considered blameworthy to have some degree of mental proliferation to elaborate on one's experiences, but the encouragement is to think in positive rather than negative ways. Negative mental proliferations are called unwholesome formations, apunya visankara, which are marked by greed, hatred, and delusion, and which generate suffering. Mindfulness, sati, should be applied here as a restraint in order to cease thinking in negative ways. Instead, one thinks in wholesome ways and creates positive mental formations. Punya bisankara, beginning with joy, pamoja. Joy is then followed by bliss, piti, and tranquility, pasadi. This is the way to solve problems and to generate happiness. The Buddha described the ascetic practices of the Niganta Jains, who clearly inflicted suffering on themselves. Instead of using a blade to shave their heads, they used tweezers to pull out each hair, one at a time. They devised all sorts of strategies to increase suffering. They would drive in nails or thorns to their sleeping platforms and lie on these. They would abstain from food and water for long periods. In the cold season, they would soak in chilly rivers. In the hot season, they would stand out in the blazing sun. The Buddha described these practices of self-mortification as examples of self-inflicted suffering. These are examples from history. The reader can think of comparable ways in which modern people unnecessarily pile suffering onto themselves. 2. To not forsake righteous happiness. Righteous happiness can be found in everyday situations. Take, for example, those lay people who earn their living honestly. They use their money for enjoyment and to support their families and dependents, according to the teaching on the 4 kinds of happiness for householders, Gihi Sukha. The happiness of having wealth, the happiness of spending wealth, the happiness of being free from debt, and the happiness of performing virtuous and blameless deeds, of performing good deeds by way of body, speech, and mind, happiness that causes no harm to anyone. This kind of righteous happiness should not be neglected or forsaken. There are numerous kinds of righteous happiness. There is the happiness stemming from generosity, dana, moral conduct, sila, and cultivation of the mind, bhavana. There is the elevated happiness of developing tranquility meditation, samatha bhavana, and insight meditation, vipassana bhavana. Alternatively, there is the happiness of loving kindness and compassion, or the happiness of the 4 principles of service. In sum, these kinds of happiness should not be renounced or objected to. Those people who adhere to a doctrine of extreme asceticism aim to inflict more suffering on themselves, and they thus shun happiness. 3. To not indulge in any sort of happiness, even righteous happiness. Non-indulgence in any form of happiness is a vital factor and indicates an advanced level of spiritual development. Experiencing righteous forms of happiness is already an excellent step in spiritual practice, but problems can arise due to such happiness. Namely, people may get attached to or blindly absorbed in it. This attachment or indulgence leads to laziness, heedlessness, and decline. One who is able to escape from this pitfall has reached an important stage in practice. When one has reached this stage, happiness is unable to dominate the mind. First, one does not fall into heedlessness. Happiness does not become a harmful influence. Second, one does not lose one's independence. One is not enslaved by happiness. Third, one has the opportunity to develop higher forms of happiness. 4, to strive in order to bring an end to the cause of suffering. In other words, to strive in order to realize higher forms of happiness, all the way to supreme happiness. The effort to bring an end to the cause of suffering leads to perfect happiness. As long as the source or seed of suffering remains, there is still the potential for suffering to resurface. Suffering is still latent. At this stage, happiness is still imperfect. Here, the cause of suffering must be completely eliminated. This final factor explains why the term cessation of suffering is so widely used. It points clearly and definitively to the necessary task. As stated earlier, the expression development of happiness is useful, but it is open-ended. It does not clearly indicate the final goal of practice. Although this process can be described in both a positive and a negating way, only a negating description is decisive and clear. Suffering is completely removed, with perfect happiness remaining. The expression, to strive in order to bring an end to, indicates how the elimination of the cause of suffering goes hand in hand with effort. The causes for suffering do not necessarily vanish immediately. Rather, one gradually reduces greed, hatred, and delusion, and weakens craving, tanha, conceit, mana, and fixed views, ditthi. In this way, one practices according to the path by developing virtuous conduct, concentration, and wisdom. Mental defilements diminishing, ignorance decreases. Relatively speaking, this is the same as gradually increasing happiness. This fourth factor can thus be paraphrased as the development of happiness. But for the sake of clarity, one adds the qualification, to develop happiness to perfection. This is why the earlier definition in parentheses states, to strive in order to realize higher forms of happiness, all the way to supreme happiness, Paramasukha. For this fourth factor to be fulfilled, one must link it with the third factor, of not indulging in any form of happiness, of not getting stuck, acting heedlessly, abandoning oneself to some form of pleasure, or ceasing to make effort. The fulfillment of the third factor enables one to reach the fourth factor and to reach spiritual perfection. So now I'm going to read from a sutta mentioned, the Devadaha Sutta. And this is from Handful of Leaves, Volume 2, beginning on page 416. And I'm going to read excerpts from Ajahn Geoff's introduction and excerpts from his translation of the sutta. In this sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 101, the Buddha refutes the theories of the Jains, here called the Nigantas, an order of contemplatives flourishing in India during his time. Although on the surface this sutta may seem to be of strictly historical interest, it makes two important points that are very relevant to some common misunderstandings about Buddhism alive today. The first point concerns the Buddha's teaching on action, or karma. The general understanding of this teaching is that actions from the past determine present pleasure and pain, while present actions determine future pleasure and pain. As he, the Buddha, interrogates the Nigantas, he makes the point that if all pleasure and pain experienced in the present were determined by past action, why is it that they now feel the pain of harsh treatment when they practice asceticism, and no pain of harsh treatment when they don't? If past action were the sole determining factor, then present action should have no effect on their present experience of pleasure and pain. In this way, the Buddha points to one of the most distinctive features of his own teaching on karma, that the present experience of pleasure and pain is a combined result of both past and present actions. This seemingly small addition to the notion of karma plays an enormous role in allowing for the exercise of free will and the possibility of putting an end to suffering before the effects of all past actions have ripened. In other words, this addition is what makes Buddhist practice possible. It makes it possible for a person who has completed the practice to survive and teach it with full authority to others. The second important point touched on in this sutta, how to put an end to pain and suffering, relates to the first. If the cause of present suffering were located exclusively in the past, no one could do anything in the present moment to stop that suffering. The most that could be done would be to endure suffering while not creating any new karma leading to future suffering. Although this was the Jain approach to practice, many people at present believe that it is the Buddhist approach as well. Meditation, according to this understanding, is the process of purifying the mind of old karma by training it to look on with non-reactive equanimity as pain arises. The pain is the result of old karma, the equanimity adds no new karma, and thus over time, all old karma can be burned away. In this sutta, however, the Buddha heaps ridicule on this idea. The Buddha then provides his own account of how meditation actually works in putting an end to pain and suffering. His discussion shows that the problem underlying pain is not past action but passion in the present for the causes of pain. In other words, pain is not inevitable. Present suffering can be prevented by changing one's understanding of and attitude toward the cause of suffering in the present. The Buddha illustrates this principle with the simile of a man in love with a woman. As long as he feels passion for her, he will suffer when he sees her enjoying the company of another man. When, seeing the connection between his suffering and his passion, he abandons that passion, he will no longer suffer from that cause. Thus, the practice must focus on ways to understand and bring about dispassion for the cause of stress and pain here and now. As the Buddha points out in Majjhima Nikaya 106, equanimity plays an important role in this practice, but it can also be an object for passion and delight, which would then stand in the way of true release. Thus he notes here that in some cases, dispassion can arise simply from onlooking equanimity directed at the causes of stress. In other cases, it can come only through exertion, the mental effort, through the fabrication of directed thought, evaluation, and perception, to develop the discernment needed to see through and abandon any and all passion. The remainder of this sutta is devoted to a standard map of how the practice develops over time, showing how the proper mixture of onlooking equanimity combined with fabrication and exertion can lead to dispassion, and through dispassion to release from all stress and suffering. Now I'll be reading excerpts from that sutta. The Buddha, just note, the Buddha criticizes the teachings of the Nigantas, the Jains, and then he concludes that section by saying, this, as in referring to their teaching, is how striving is fruitless, how exertion is fruitless. And how is striving fruitful? How is exertion fruitful? There is the case where a monk, when not loaded down, does not load himself down with pain, nor does he reject pleasure that accords with the Dhamma, although he is not infatuated on that pleasure. He discerns that, when I exert a physical, verbal, or mental fabrication against this cause of stress, then from the fabrication of exertion there is dispassion. When I look on with equanimity at that cause of stress, then from the development of equanimity there is dispassion. So he exerts a fabrication against the cause of stress, for which dispassion comes from the fabrication of exertion, and develops equanimity with regard to the cause of stress, for which dispassion comes from the development of equanimity. Thus, the stress coming from the cause of stress, where there is dispassion from the fabrication of exertion, is exhausted, and the stress coming from the cause of stress, where there is dispassion from the development of equanimity, is exhausted. Suppose that a man is in love with a woman, his mind ensnared with fierce desire, fierce passion. He sees her standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing. What do you think, monks? As he sees her standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing, would sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair arise in him? Yes, Lord. Why is that? Because he is in love with her, his mind ensnared with fierce desire, fierce passion. Now suppose the thought were to occur to him, I am in love with this woman, my mind ensnared with fierce desire, fierce passion. When I see her standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing, then sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair arise within me. Why don't I abandon my desire and dispassion for that woman? So he abandons his desire and passion for that woman, and afterwards sees her standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing. What do you think, monks? As he sees her standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing, would sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair arise in him? No, Lord. Why is that? He is dispassionate toward that woman. In the same way, the monk, when not loaded down, does not load himself down with pain, nor does he reject pleasure that accords with Dhamma, although he is not infatuated with that pleasure. He discerns that, when I exert a fabrication against this cause of stress, then from the fabrication of exertion there is dispassion. When I look on with equanimity at that cause of stress, then from the development of equanimity there is dispassion. So he exerts a against the cause of stress for which dispassion comes from the fabrication of exertion, and develops equanimity with regard to the cause of stress for which dispassion comes from development of equanimity. Thus, the stress coming from the cause of stress where there is dispassion from the fabrication of exertion is exhausted, and the stress coming from the cause of stress where there is dispassion from the development of equanimity is exhausted. And further, the monk notices this: when I live according to my pleasure, unskillful qualities increase in me, and skillful qualities decline. When I exert myself with stress and pain, though, unskillful qualities decline in me, and skillful qualities increase. Why don't I exert myself with stress and pain? So he exerts himself with stress and pain, and while he is exerting himself with stress and pain, unskillful qualities decline in him, and skillful qualities increase. Then, at a later time, he would no longer exert himself with stress and pain. Why is that? Because he has attained the goal for which he was exerting himself with stress and pain. That is why at a later time he would no longer exert himself with stress and pain. Suppose a Fletcher were to heat and warm an arrow shaft between two flames, making it straight and pliable. Then at a later time he would no longer heat and warm the shaft between two flames, making it straight and pliable. Why is that? Because he has attained the goal for which he was heating and warming the shaft. That is why at a later time he would no longer heat and warm the shaft between two flames, making it straight and pliable.